climate crisis kind of offers us this portal into a new world, into a world where it's not built on extractivism, it's not built on hierarchies, it's not built on devaluing the lives of the majority in order to create wealth for a very, very small percentage of people. It's not that radical, it should be common sense.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is a climate campaigner activist, Mikaela Loach, who you may have seen on Channel 4 News and lots of other media outlets talking about the climate crisis and about direct action and lots of things that she's been involved in through her life. She is, according to the cover in her new book, a medical student. She's got a degree in global health policy. She's an organizer, a climate justice activist, and a soft black girl. She's on a mission to build liberation and inform the masses through her focus on the climate crisis and its intersections of anti-racism, feminism, ethical fashion, wealth inequality, and migrant rights. So there's a lot you've put into this. This is basically what you think about the world.
Yes, that's my way to change the world.
So, I mean, well, I don't want to get hung up on definitions, but what's a soft black girl?
I think for me, it comes from this. I think as we get older, almost, we're encouraged to become harder. I think especially as a black woman, it's encouraged that in the face of the oppression that you face and the harm that you face, you should harden, and that's what resilience is, it's hardness. And that's what strength is, it's hardness. But I actually want to remain soft. I want to be moved by things in the world. I want to have my heart broken, and I want to cry if I see injustice. And I don't see that as weakness. I see that as a strength, because I think it's a lot harder to remain soft in the face of this world. And I want to be soft, and I want to be a soft black girl.
Is that partly what the pink's about?
I guess so. I don't really know. I thought about this a lot, because obviously I get asked about this all the time, because it's the tiniest bit unhinged to wear only pink all the time.
It's lovely. I mean, puts everyone in a good mood.
Yeah, but I mean, firstly, it's easier to buy clothes secondhand if you only buy one colour of
clothing. You only wear pink?
I only wear pink. Is that level of bizarre. I mean, this was secondhand. My shoes, even that I'm wearing now, also got on secondhand app. But I think part of it, I wondered if it was that when I was much younger, I think I felt that because I was being characterised so often as being like more aggressive than perhaps my peers were, or harder than my peers were, that I almost didn't want to seem soft as well. I wanted to play into that. So I rejected a lot of femininity a lot when I was a lot younger. And then I think maybe as an adult, I'm trying to reclaim that femininity and that softness that I wasn't really offered as a child. But that's me also just overthinking all my choices. So
because you were a sort of a very activist teenager.
I guess so. I mean, compared to the people where I grew up in the countryside in Surrey, in a very white area, in a very middle class area, and kind of people doing activism wasn't a very normal thing. And so compared to my peers, I was the activist one that always had a different cause that I was fighting for.
And how come you were there? I mean, your family are from Jamaica.
Yeah, my mum is Jamaican, and my dad is British, from Nottingham. And I was born in Jamaica. My dad had moved to Jamaica a few years before, met my mum at the same workplace, and they had me. And then we lived there for a few years when I was born, when I was younger. And then for safety, moved to the UK, just because Jamaica at the time wasn't super, super safe to live. There was a lot of security concerns for a lot of people. And moving to the UK, they wanted us to live somewhere that was safer. And so we moved to leafy white Surrey. And we were able to do that also because of a lot of different privileges as well that we had access to. But differently, my grandma's brother, he moved to the UK with the Windrush generation. And they all kind of grew up in Edmonton, so in an area of London where a lot of different people from the Jamaican diaspora have grown up in. But when we moved here, we didn't. My mum was like, if I'm going to move from Jamaica to the UK, I don't want to move to London because it's also got safety concerns.
So when I grew up in a sort of a fairly middle class village in Lancashire, I was the only Indian in the village. Were you the only black girl in the village?
For sure, yeah. I mean, my mum and my family, we were the first black people that a lot of people had ever seen before in where we kind of grew up. And I experienced that a lot at school, whether I joined school and people would say my first impression of you was, I can't believe she's so black, given that I'm a very light-skinned black person as well. And so I think I experienced a lot of interpersonal racism growing up, more so than structural racism, because I grew up in a white and
I'm very surprised because, how old are you? You're 25?
25, yeah.
So you're talking about recent years, in the last 10, 15 years, you're talking about quite overt racism in Surrey.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I'm sure people are still experiencing that now as well. Things have definitely changed, but not enough. It would be things of like not being small things of like not being included as a child in games because they're like, oh, princesses don't look like you, so you can't be in this game. Or it would be bigger things of kids calling me slurs at school or not including me, or my mum experiencing worse impacts from people in the village who wouldn't really accept her as well. And so things have changed, but interpersonally not that much. But I also recognize that I think growing up, I felt like, oh, this is really unfair that we're being treated this way or that we are being treated differently. But then I've come to appreciate that whilst we were getting this maybe disproportionate interpersonal racism, I wasn't being impacted by structural racism as maybe like my cousins who live in Edmonton are, by the fact that they are having to live in areas with like illegal pollution levels because most of the infrastructure that causes pollution is put next to people of colour generally in this country and globally.
So we're getting into the intersectionality then of racial justice and climate justice. I mean, do you want to just lay out what you believe?
Yeah, I think that often some people who come to caring about the climate crisis, they come to it saying, oh, everything else in this world is kind of okay, apart from the fact that we're causing the climate crisis, and this is the big issue, and this is what we need to focus on. And it's almost like they become awakened to all of this, and they want to take action. But I think instead, what the climate crisis does is illuminate the fact that all of these different systems that exist in our world of capitalism, of whiteness and white supremacy, of other kind of hierarchical injustices, they are causing the destruction of all of us, and they're connected to this climate crisis as well. And so it's not that everything's right with these systems apart from the fact that we're causing the climate crisis, it's that the climate crisis kind of came from these systems. And so to understand that, we have to kind of go back in time into the fact that why are we in this climate crisis in the first place? It's because of the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Why was that even happening in the first place? That happened through the colonial projects, through going into many nations across the world, like Nigeria in particular, and buying countries in order to give exclusive access to the oil reserves there, and then those oil reserves being burnt and the harm that was caused to those communities, and then that producing many more emissions, which at first we can't have known that was what's going to cause this climate crisis. But as time went on, and there was an awareness through companies who did some of the first climate science and were also kind of producing this crisis, they realized, oh, the things that we're making money from, these things that we're producing, are going to cause the destruction of our entire planet. But in particular, they're going to cause more destruction on nations in the global south. Those were kind of tropical nations is what they found were where the worst impacts would be felt and the worst kind of the impacts of the climate crisis would be felt. But they didn't decide, oh, we're going to stop burning fossil fuels, we're going to stop extracting them. Instead, they did the opposite. They buried this science. They started like the biggest kind of public influence campaign we've ever seen, which was climate denial at first, and then has moved to climate delay. And I think that was a deliberate choice there, that some lives are not valuable enough to save, and in particular lives in the global south, lives in the global majority. And so I think if we understand that the climate crisis came from colonialism, that it came from this kind of idea of white supremacy, of some lives being more valuable than others, if it came from capitalism, of extracting wealth from peoples and from the land, then we can understand that we have to tackle these same systems if we want to tackle this crisis. And therefore, I think there's actually a bit of hope that comes in there.
How sure are you that that's the case? I mean, like, couldn't you tackle the climate crisis without tackling those things? You know, because the climate crisis wasn't. I mean, those things happened as a result of development and consumption and capitalism and all of those things. It wasn't the driving force, was it? So, you know, surely you can envisage a world in which all of those terrible things that you're describing, still, like, you know, there's colonialism, there's racism, there's exploitation, but you actually solve the climate crisis because you just do things differently.
But I think that then it's like, what does solving the climate crisis mean? Because I think even if we stop emissions, for example, so say that we stop burning fossil fuels today somehow, or within the time period we need to stay within the kind of important 1.5 degrees of warming limit. Even if we stop emissions, but we don't do it in a way that centres justice, in a way that actually tackles these systems, we're still going to be in a crisis of some sort. There are so many impacts of the climate crisis that we cannot reverse at this point. And so I think we need to think about, what is this world that we're going towards? And do we want it to be a crisis instead of where the same kind of extractivism, that same violence that's inflicted on communities to extract fossil fuels is instead inflicted on communities to extract lithium in order to build batteries? And so I think that it's that the climate crisis kind of offers us this portal into a new world, into a world where it's not built on extractivism, it's not built on hierarchies, it's not built on devaluing the lives of the majority in order to like create wealth for a very, very small percentage of people. And so I think for me, that's where this kind of hope kind of comes in, is that, we actually can rip up the roots of the old world and build a new one. And so in two ways, it's like, so my book's called It's Not That Radical, but it's a little bit of a two-pronged title, because in one sense, if the fact that we have to rip up the roots of this world, and the definition that Angela Davis gives of radical just means going to the root, it is that radical. We have to go to the roots. We have to rip them up. But in the way that we get there, and in what we're doing, and in the definition of how the mainstream media often term radical, they say radical is ridiculous, outrageous, not possible. It's not that radical. It should be common sense, and we need to make sure that we're communicating it as common sense.
Because you think those changes are actually just sort of fairly normal, progressive steps?
Well, I think it's what we actually all want. I think that as humans, we just want each other to be safe, and we want ourselves to be safe. And I think that we all do want everyone to be able to live in, not all of us maybe, but the majority of us want people to be able to live in dignity, and we don't want a world in which the majority of people are having to live really insecure lives for a very, very small amount of people to have more than they could ever need. And I think that there's a way in which we've been like manipulated to believe that this is as good as we can get it, and this is everything that it can be. But I think we actually can get so much more. So,
I mean, you've explained how you ended up in Surrey, but where did the fire come from about the climate?
So I think my parents were really keen that if I was not going to grow up in Jamaica, I would not leave Jamaica behind. So I'd still understand where I came from. I'd still understand how my people's liberation was fought and won. And I think learning about that history, and the history that kind of, slavery was not just handed, like the end of slavery was not handed down from above. It was also fought from the ground up, really gave me this perspective that change is an active process that everyone participates in some way, and it's not linear and it's not easy, but also that I come from people who have fought as well, and who are still fighting.
And so that if you were worried about the climate or about extreme weather conditions or whatever might be troubling you, you have to go and do something.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, also because I remember when I was 5 years old, I'd snuck downstairs and my parents were watching the news. Maybe you were on the news, who knows? And it was covering the tsunami that happened, the Boxing Day tsunami. And I peeked through the door and saw kids that were the same age as me going through really an awful experience because of disaster. And my parents saw me there and I started crying and I got very upset, and they were like, okay, how do you feel about this? Talk me through that. And then my dad asked me, if you're upset about this, what do you think you can do about it? And I think that being asked that question, even at a very young age, I always ask myself that question now. If my heart feels soft and broken, I don't just sit with that heartbreak alone. I think, what can I do about this? And in that time when I was 5, all I did was go to school and organise a bake sale, which is really small. But I think it more just showed me that also not only you don't have to sit in front of disaster and not do anything, but also that if you do things with other people, you can do so much more, because, other kids at my school joined that bake sale and we were able to raise more money than we would have been able to do alone. And I think as I got older and throughout my life, I've pushed myself a bit more of what can I do, and what can I do that takes me a little step outside of my comfort zone each time. And I think it's so important for all of us that we don't have to see terrible things happening in this world and just sit by and say, oh, well, that sucks. We can say, oh, what can we do about it? And what can we change? Because that's how history has changed things in the past as well. I mean,
so you've gone from sort of bake sale to sort of very, very big vision of changing the world.
Yeah.
But along the way, you've done activism, direct action, you've taken legal action against the government. So let's just talk about whether those things work a little bit. I mean, let's take direct action, because obviously that's the one that sort of winds a lot of people up. Do you think it alienates some people?
Maybe some people, yeah. I think it depends on what the direct action is. Direct action looks like so many different things. So
if you stop a motorway.
If you stop a motorway, there are going to be some people who are going to be annoyed about that, obviously. And I think that the point of direct action also isn't that everyone's really happy and everyone's fine with it. And I think that also if the status quo is super chill with what you're doing, maybe you're not actually challenging the status quo in some way. But I personally think that we need to think about what are we targeting, and for what reason, and for what goal, and where is this on I think we need a wider journey of where we're trying to head towards. And I think sometimes we can get distracted with let's get in the media, or, let's be seen doing things, rather than what's the impact of this? Or I don't know, for example, when I took direct action, one of the first times I took direct action was during Extinction Rebellion's kind of Autumn Rebellion, whatever it was called at the time. And I was part of Extinction Rebellion in Scotland. And we occupied outside of what was then the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, that has now been changed its name about 50 times. But basically, it's the part of the government that both is meant to be tackling the climate crisis and also is giving huge amounts of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry in the same building. And our site was called Power and Truth, and we were blocking outside of that building and those roads, particularly to target both politicians and that particular building and that particular department of the government, and to raise awareness of the subsidies that were happening. And I think in that way, we had a very clear target of what we were trying to do, of what this was for. And I do think to some extent, maybe we're like losing a bit of having that kind of clarity of vision of where we're going and where we're moving forward to.
So the government should probably be a more obvious target, or the
fossil fuel industry in particular.
Yes.
So when we managed to stop an oil field called Cambo. So Cambo was a massive, or still is, a massive oil field in the North Sea that has not been extracted from yet because of campaigning that happened. And part of that campaigning, which was only in 6 months, some of that was direct action in the sense of Greenpeace took a bunch of kayaks and blocked infrastructure from being able to go out into the North Sea. And I think that's also very strategic, because it's like, oh, we're going to stop this oil from being able to be taken out of the sea or the ground under the sea. And so I think that that's a strategic target. But I think one thing is that I know that we're kind of, without saying it, we're talking about Just Stop Oil. But one thing that they have said, and I think is that they used to target fossil fuel infrastructure more, and then they didn't get in the media, and that's why these other targets have been taken. But I think I would say that just because you're not getting in the media doesn't mean you're not having an impact. I think that if you can cause financial damage in the sense of just delaying things from getting out there, that's going to have a really big impact on these companies, because it's going to make it not financially viable for them to do these oil projects if they can't get their infrastructure out there because people are in the way. And so I think that might be more strategic than, I don't know, maybe just making loud noise that gets a lot of attention but maybe doesn't do as much.
And do you ever worry that that kind of action, directly targeting fossil fuel companies that would cause them higher costs, will actually only ever recycle back to consumers and affect the poorest people in society and in the world?
But then there also has to be something of if we don't get off oil and gas, those who are most marginalised in our world are going to be also impacted so much more. And so I think that we shouldn't have to get to this point in which we're having to do the most extreme things in order for us to have the transition that we need. And so I think that what's happening is the reason why people are taking maybe more extreme means is because our governments are not taking the actions they need to. Things like if there's something so simple of insulation, if insulation was funded adequately in this country, people's energy bills in the short and long term would be so much lower. And so even if there was a spike in the price of oil, it wouldn't be impacting people in the same way. And I think that the problem is that those things haven't been prioritised.
And they would have been. And the insulation rules were literally reversed because of financial constraints. The government argued at the time it was the you don't save the planet by wrecking the economy, or whatever the phrase was that George Osborne used. And we're seeing a return of that now, where this government clearly feels that there is a large constituency of people who agree with the idea that it's smarter to slow things down, to not cause upfront costs. And we haven't seen their political research, but they're obviously doing it for a reason, because they think there are people out there who agree with that. Do you feel that you're being pushed back again?
Yeah,
in 2023, the way that you were under Osborne Cameron?
I mean, I definitely think so, because I found myself, for example, when I was on Channel 4 News recently talking about Rishi Sunak's kind of pushback on green policy, I found myself defending net zero policy that I think is quite
You don't even agree with net zero,
No.
do you? Yeah.
I think that net zero is not a climate solution in some way as well. And it's difficult to talk about that now, because this Overton window, or this common ground of what is seen as reasonable or acceptable or politically possible, has been pushed so far over by these very deliberate pushbacks on certain policy, all this very deliberate, as Sunak has been doing, just saying policies that don't exist and then saying you're
So you
scrapping
feel
them.
that centre ground has shifted back?
I've already felt
because there was
that.
a period where it felt like public opinion had moved, to really think about the climate crisis and what we should do about it. It's shifted back now.
I think it's shifted in the sense of that people are confused, and I think that people do care about the climate crisis. So polling has shown that the majority of the UK public, for example, really, really care about the climate crisis. They also do not want more oil and gas. Like that's something that's actually been shown really clear. And they want more renewable energy. So what policy is doing is not in line with what people actually want. But I think that what the Conservatives in particular are doing at the moment is trying to confuse people by like throwing in a load of policies that don't exist, and then people won't know what is and saying that climate action would mean you have to get rid of your phone and you have to have 50 people in your car and you have to, not eat meat and you have to do all these things, and presenting it as if like, and this is like this very deliberate way of presenting climate action as, oh, everyone has to have less and your life will be so much worse. And I think that in response to that, we have to offer an alternative that says, actually, climate action can offer you more of the things that you actually want in your life. Like you can have more time in your life to enjoy your life. You can have stronger communities. You can have a warmer home. You can have more autonomy over your energy, and that won't be being set by energy companies who are making a lot of money off your despair. And I think showing that alternative is so important at the moment, and that alternative is connected to that kind of intersectionality that I talked about before.
So, I mean, where do you stand on sort of the responsibility of the individual versus government? So, we were talking about heating and all the rest of it. So, I have a house in London. So my boiler breaks down next week, and it's broken. It's 15 years old, and the guy says you need to replace it.
Yeah.
To replace that, it's going to cost me £2,000. To switch my whole system to a heat pump, an electric-powered heat pump, and all of the other changes are probably going to cost me, I don't know, 10, 15. What should I do? What is my responsibility as an individual? Do I have responsibility as an individual? Or is this for government to create a infrastructure of grants and help to make that happen?
I think that when we talk about climate, sometimes there's this idea that like responsibility is diffuse, as if like everyone has, or the agency is equal between everyone and we all have the same responsibility in the same agency. But I don't think that's true. I think there's a lot of things that depend on what our responsibility is our like ability to do that. For example, are you able to spend that much money on a boiler without that compromising your ability to live, in the sense of like,
so if I can afford it, I should.
I think if you can afford it, you should. And I think that's, but I think that what needs to happen is that this needs to be accessible for everyone. It shouldn't be that just the richest in our society are able to live climate-friendly lives. Like that's ridiculous. That also
that's kind of where we are now.
Yeah,
isn't it?
No,
I've got an electric car because I can afford one.
Yeah, and that shouldn't be how, because the climate crisis is an issue where we have to get there together, and it has to be that everyone's able to. We have to reduce emissions from everyone, and the way to do that isn't to like leave it to like consumer choice or to people who have agency to do that. We need support from the government for that to be able to be possible.
So you said that you found yourself defending an idea, which is net zero, that you don't really agree with. Just explain that, because that's going to surprise a lot of people as well, who are going, well, hang on a minute, I've just got my head around, supporting the idea of net zero.
This is what's hard.
Why do some of you activists don't like it?
So I think my problem with net zero is that it's this idea of like kind of creative accounting in some way of like, oh, so we'll reduce some bits here, but we're also going to like, do this thing to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So for example, a lot of our net zero claims globally, so not just in the UK, but lots of global governments are kind of based on this idea of, I say idea, but it's this structure of carbon capture and storage. So it's this technology that says we can like suck a load of carbon out of the atmosphere, and that is what's going to help us get to this target of net zero. But the problem is that carbon capture and storage technology has not been able to be scaled at the scale with which it's being said in almost every NDC, so nationally determined contribution and net zero plan in the world. There was a report called the Land Gap Report recently that found out that the same amount of land that's currently being used for food production worldwide, so imagine how much land that is, would be required just to be used for carbon capture and storage and carbon sequestration, so sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere. And that amount of land is not available globally. And it wouldn't be available without taking and causing huge amounts of land grabs from peoples who've already experienced lots of land grabs, especially Indigenous rights would be compromised even more. And so the problem with net zero is it's not actually about reducing emissions as such, and to the extent to which we need it. It's somehow like, oh, let's balance out those emissions somewhere. But I think what we need to do is have policy that's actually saying, okay, the priority is we get emissions down as much as we possibly can in the time frame that we possibly can, whilst making that a just transition where we protect people's jobs, we protect people's lives, it's ethical, and we're not leaving anyone behind, rather than this kind of idea of net zero, which says, okay, well, oh, we found this new technology that we haven't actually fully tested or worked out, but it means we can extract fossil fuels for even longer. Because we have to think about who is it that loves carbon capture and storage in particular. It's the fossil fuel companies. They love it. They're like, oh, there was even fossil fuel executives who've been quoted like saying how this technology means they'll be able to continue extracting fossil fuels like 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, because they're very happy about that. And if they want this so badly and they've caused the climate crisis and delayed it for so long, I think we really need to question why is it that so many of our agreements are based upon this? And I think we can do a lot better than that.
I mean, you actually write about Israel-Palestine in this context, don't you?
Yeah.
In the impact on Palestinian areas of technology. As you look at what's going on at the moment, do you feel all of these arguments, making an argument about Israel-Palestine with regard to climate justice, is just kind of like, forget that, because there's a bigger emergency going on right now. That this is kind of, there's a pushback, isn't it? As we talked about the pushback of sort of politics, but there's a pushback because of cost of living, now perhaps because of geopolitics and the actual war going on in Israel-Palestine. What do you think the effect of these things is on your activism and the things you care about?
I think that sometimes there's this kind of idea that when there's an issue that's going on, there's an injustice going on at some point in the world or at a time that isn't directly seen as climate related or whatever your focus is related, is that we're almost having to pivot completely off what we don't normally talk about and talk about this. But I see it quite differently in that all of these issues in this world are connected to each other in some way. And I don't think it's about making the connections, I think it's about illuminating them. Like, I think it's almost like each of us have our little candle, if you'll let me make an analogy. And I think when we learn more about different issues in the world, that candle becomes brighter and it illuminates those connections that already exist. And maybe we get given a flashlight when we read a different book or when we speak to a different person from a different context. And more of those connections are illuminated and we realize how connected everything is to each other. And so I think that when we're talking about Palestine, for example, I think that it's not that we leave the climate argument behind, because the climate arguments that I talk about in the book around Israel and Palestine is about the climate apartheid that exists there, in the sense that the Israeli government control and siphon a lot of the water off from the West Bank. And as water becomes more and more scarce, especially in the Middle East region, that's going to only get worse. And this kind of control of resources in order to in a very fascist way to control a population is this kind of idea of ecofascism, which is being put in by a lot of different governments. And I think it's not that we ignore that that's been happening for a very long time. It's more of this understanding that actually illuminates much more of what's going on, I think.
Just explain what you mean by ecofascism, because obviously fascism is a very emotive word, especially in the context of Israel.
Yeah, no, of course. So ecofascism is basically as climate, in a way to make climate action, restricting resources from peoples and restricting the autonomy from peoples in order to do climate action in some way. So, for example, in order to provide more water for a population as water gets scarce, doing that in a way where you're restricting that water from a different population in order to, and therefore causing harm to that population. That's a manifestation of ecofascism. But ecofascism can look like a lot of different things, and it's manifesting more and more across the world, and it's also being used as the justification for many acts of terror across the world as well. So whether it was the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, where a white supremacist terrorist went and killed Muslims in a mosque, and he cited overpopulation and ecofascism as his ideologies of why he was taking those actions. So did the Buffalo shooter in New York in a majority black neighborhood, and so did the El Paso shooter in the United States, which was the most deadly attack on Latinos in history.
So somebody's listening to this, or they read your book and they read all your arguments around politics and migration and all these things. They say, all right, well, what can I do? What should I be doing? What are you actually arguing people should have to do? Is it the way they vote, the way they act, the way they behave, change the bigger system?
So there are loads of things that we can do. My friend Tom Mayer Gregory has a print which says there's a role for everyone in the climate movement, and I really love that. And it has, illustrator to someone who does the finances, to someone who does talks and speaks, to someone who makes cups of tea for people when they're having a bad time at an action or in a meeting, someone who makes spreadsheets. There's so many different roles. And I think because the climate crisis is such a huge reaches into everything kind of problem, it means that all of us will have skills already that are helpful into tackling it. And I think the way that we find how do we do those skills and how do we use them is, one, we can look at where are we currently? Like, what are you doing? What's your job? What do you currently do? What's your community? What does that look like? Who do you interact with? And how could it be that you use that to direct towards climate justice and to direct towards a more climate-friendly, safe world? But also, I think it's, if you look at your community, could you join a group in your community? That's the thing that I always encourage people. I say, just join a group in your community or even online that is a climate justice, climate action group. And I think being part of a group, you'll also be doing things together and you're able to achieve more. But also you'll learn so much more about what we should be doing from the people in those spaces who've been doing it for longer, and that we can take each other with us.
And in, I suppose, what has been a relatively short adult journey so far, you've also kind of changed your own mind about what you want to do with yourself. Because, I mean, you describe yourself as a medical student.
It's changed since then.
You're not really anymore.
Yeah, I think so. When the paperback comes out, it will say former medical student instead. But in the last few months, I made quite a huge, life-changing decision to no longer be practicing medicine or studying medicine or becoming a doctor. And that was a really big decision to make because there's pictures of me at 2 years old with a stethoscope, play stethoscope, listening to my mum's belly and pretending to be a doctor. And growing up, I think I got bullied really, really, really badly at school. And I think I put a lot of my self-worth was in academics and studying and being the best I could be at school, and then getting into medical school and trying to be a doctor. And that was so much of my self-worth was put into that. But actually being a student doctor in the NHS, I realized that a lot of the patients that were coming in, they were sick because of things that we couldn't fix as doctors, in the sense that someone would come in and they had respiratory illness of some sort. And the cause of that was because they live in unsafe housing, because they're either their landlord has not repaired mold in their home, or they're living in council housing that is unsafe for them to be fully living in. And us as doctors, we would patch that person up, make sure that they are well enough, and then send them back into the same conditions that made them unwell, and then they come back in. Or whether it be that it's because of not having access to safe food or things like that. And I think that over the years, I think I felt a bit disillusioned with myself, but was that the best role for me? Is this where I can make the most change practicing medicine? I think for some people it is, because they know that this is this is what they can do the best at. This is what they're the best at. But for me, I think I was doing a lot of organising work on the side and lots of trying to communicate about these issues. And I think I realised if I can try and in some way shift the systems that put people in these unsafe conditions in the first place, then that's still healing work, and that is still work that makes health better, but it just looks different. And that I felt like I was better at doing that work than I was at being a doctor. That way. It's
a very brave decision in a way for somebody who wants to do good, because obviously with medicine, being a doctor, it's very, very tangible.
Yeah.
Doing the good, you save people's lives. And as a climate activist, how do you judge success?
I think it's really difficult, and it's not as tangible. It's not like I have a patient that comes in and they leave better. But I've had to gain some sort of peace with the fact that I'm not always going to see the success of the actions that I'm doing, or sometimes I'm not even going to know if that was the right thing to do in that moment. But I see it like mushrooms and mycelium, which, if you let me be a bit airy-fairy, I think I see the climate movement and movements for social change like that, in the fact that mycelium are under the ground all the time. There's millions of their networks. They're growing from death and from life, and they're talking to each other, and they're talking to trees, and they're just incredible. And these networks exist underground and we don't see them. But one day maybe we'll go foraging and we'll find this amazing, massive mushroom, this chicken of the woods, which is a big mushroom to forage for. And you'll think that's a miracle. It came out of nowhere, because you don't see those mycelium networks that's going on underground. And I think that in a similar way, climate action can be, or any movement for social change, it can be that we only think about the mushrooms. We think about when the civil rights movement won things, or when we stopped the Cambo oil field. We'll think about those mushrooms, and when we don't get the mushroom, we'll be like, well, our work is useless. But actually, for us to even, for example, stop the Cambo oil field in 6 months, that was only because mycelial networks of people doing work that didn't succeed in that time had been built. So people had been campaigning against oil and gas in the North Sea for decades and hadn't won. They hadn't won their fights, and it might have felt pointless, but they built mycelial networks for it to be possible for our mushroom of the Stop Cambo campaign to be successful. And so I think I try and remind myself that I am so grateful that those people didn't give up. I'm so grateful that they didn't say, this isn't worth it, this isn't getting where we want it to be, we're not getting the success, and they kept building those networks. And so in a similar way, I have to just have trust that the mushroom is coming, and I might not see the mushroom in my lifetime. I might not, or maybe the mushroom's growing and I'm just not seeing it, but the mushroom is coming, and the mushroom is worth it, and it's worth it to build those networks, and that death is also a part of building those networks.
If you could change the world in any way overnight, how would you change it?
I think people expect me to say that I'd get rid of all fossil fuels, but it's important to note that I think we could get rid of all fossil fuels and still have a very unequal world, because the extractivism could just happen in renewables. And so I think instead I would get rid of like hierarchies in our world that make it so that the majority of people's lives are seen as like disposable or not valuable, in order to create profit for a very small amount of people. And so that seems really maybe intangible, but I think it's these hierarchies also in how we see each other and how we act with each other, like that create a world in which we've been able to exploit the planet to this extent, and create a world in which we have such inequality. And I think if we could tackle these hierarchies, then we could tackle all of it and create something better.
Mikaela Loach, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.